Welcome to Boardroom Statecraft. I'm Ross Hill, and in each episode, we explore how global events, ideological shifts, and emerging threats are reshaping the environment in which companies operate. Hi everybody, welcome to this week's edition of Boardroom Statecraft. I'm Ross Hill, and with me as always is Dr. Tristan Wheat. Dr. Wheat, how are we doing this week?
Very good, very good. How are you doing?
Good, hanging in there. Busy times, but busy times is generally good, so I'm not complaining. Okay, so this week is the start of just a small sporting competition being held across the US, Mexico, and Canada that we would know as the Football World Cup, and then only people in America will call it the Soccer World Cup.
And we can talk about that etymology, because I will fully defend the American use of the term soccer, hands down.
Yeah. I can't remember the actual origins of it, but I think soccer might actually be the correct term. Soccer, though, I think, isn't it?
Well, it was basically shorthand, and it stuck in America because football actually refers to like playing on your feet back in the Middle Ages. That's what separated it from horse-based sports. And then in the UK, y'all developed rugby football and then association football. And association football is now what we call soccer football. And in the US, it got shortened to soccer from association. And that was the primary term used to separate it. But then rugby just started getting called rugby. And so Europeans, British started using just the term football for soccer football, but Americans kept the shortened association soccer connection.
Okay. Well, there you go. You learn something new every day. But we're going to talk a little bit about, because of the World Cup, we're going to talk a little bit about the geopolitics of sport and of football specifically. For any of our subscribers, you might have seen that in our strategic memo that we released this week. But George Orwell wrote a very famous essay called The Sporting Spirit, and he said that sport is war minus the shooting, which as you look at various, particularly global sporting competitions, say like the Olympics and like the World Cup, geopolitics runs right through that in terms of various elements of the competition and who's allowed to compete, who's not allowed to compete, who may boycott certain events. So certainly, runs parallel to international relations.
Yeah, we tend to think of things like athletics as apolitical, and in a very specific way they are. It's just, competition, but healthy competition between countries, between teams. But it tends to get wrapped up in politics because it's used as a tool to spread a message or to promote soft power or to signal disagreement. Something we included in the strategic memo this week, for example, was the Soviet Union boycotting the World Cup in Chile because of the coup that had happened there. And so this was saying, oh, you're a right-wing government. We no longer want to, indicate any support or anything for you. You had, the Yugoslavia issue because of sanctions, well, them too, but South Africa, apartheid South Africa wasn't allowed to participate. And so it's not that sports themselves are political, but it's, kind of often used as a tool for spreading messages or, country signaling. We have the very famous 1980s with the U.S. Boycotting the Olympics, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And of course, Russia currently banned from participating in most big international competitions at the moment, including, weren't allowed to play in any qualifying or tournament games for this World Cup. And then, you mentioned the soft power element, and there's lots of interesting examples. And the most recent one, sporting wise, I think is kind of Saudi Arabia's significant investment in multiple sporting events, but primarily investing extremely heavily in their own football league
Yeah.
domestically, attracting some of the kind of most famous players by paying them enormous salaries, and actually attracting people towards the end of their career. So it's kind of like becoming one of those retirement gigs that Major League Soccer did that in the early days, where you had like people like Pele and some of the other big sporting stars go to the
Hmm.
US for like a final payday, and Saudi's kind of taken over that, but also invested heavily in golf and some other sports to promote kind of the country in a different way to
Hmm.
how it was probably being viewed by, only being viewed as an oil producing country, being viewed as a very strict Muslim country,
Hmm.
and those kind of things. And it using sport in that soft power way in order to kind of promote its image.
Hmm. I mean, think of the Olympic opening ceremonies is a very useful thing for like that kind of soft power promotion. Exactly what you're talking about. We think of Beijing in 2008, or the London Olympics. The London opening is was absolutely one of my favorites when they had the song to the NHS, which I thought was hilarious.
Yeah.
And then the Queen doing that thing with Daniel Craig, like the James Bond,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
yeah, that kind of promotion of soft power. And the US, has been doing this for a long time, say like NBA, willing to send NBA teams all over the world to participate, to try and promote that sort of soft power through basketball. And so a
Mm.
number of sports, or a number of countries and a number of sports have kind of tried this because, again, going back to the kind of original thought of sports are inherently apolitical. They're just used in a political
Yeah,
way. And that's why they're useful for kind of soft powers. Cause like, oh, this isn't really political. They just really enjoy the game. Or, they
yeah,
want to participate. And so this is just an interesting area of geopolitics, like the soft power of geopolitics, and how it's kind of utilized to promote, that soft power aspect. But it's not always successful, of course. And sports is kind of a hard thing to move from directly, the sports to an actual image of a country. And so you may have a few warm and fuzzy feelings, but it's
mm.
not the easiest thing to be like, oh, because, America is great at basketball, therefore it's a good country, or Saudi Arabia, be like, just because they give money to soccer players, suddenly, they don't have human rights abuses, that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, well, that Saudi's been heavily criticised for that.
Yeah.
Investing heavily in sport or other forms of entertainment to attract tourism and other forms of business to their economy and revenue to their economy. But people don't forget past accusations of human rights abuses, and so then and that's where you start to run in to a bit of trouble because, as you mention, sport is supposed to be apolitical, and then it is governments that try and use it politically, and that's where it's a very tricky balance because I was thinking of things like the of sporting prowess and countries trying to use that, and I think thinking Cold War times, big ideological battle, and then you had these big doping programs in countries like East Germany and Russia to a certain extent, in order to have sporting prowess on a global stage, in order to say, well, look how successful we are as a country, or the Soviet Union, or however it is, in to serve a purpose in an ideological battle for what's going on globally in politics. And I still think that there's a reason why China will invest so heavily in achieving sporting success within the Olympics in particular. It's not just out of, oh, we feel like we should invest heavily in our nation. There are some ideological and some prowess and just some kind of PR behind that.
Yeah, I think of the movie Miracle on Ice,
Oh yeah,
or the yeah, like,
yeah, that's a good example.
battling the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
American movies are great at this because you also have like the Rocky Four,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
fighting the Soviets with
Yeah.
through boxing, and this represents because we're free, therefore our athletics are better. And I think what you're saying is very right. Like going back to the Cold War where you had, multiple countries try to show the superiority of their athletes,
Hmm.
and the subtle, sometimes not so subtle indication of, oh, that means, free market capitalism is better or communism is better
Yeah.
just because our athletes
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
better.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well,
Yeah.
we can go all the way back to the Berlin Olympics, can't we? In what
Hmm.
1936, uh, where that feels like that feels like the first one where a country, Germany, is using that event ideologically to promote their own, narrative.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, and you have the famous black athletes who win from America,
Yep.
and then beat the Aryans, and I'm putting that in quotations, beat the Aryans, and Hitler storming off because like his views of racial hierarchy are being
Hmm.
disproven,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
literally in the sports.
Yeah.
And but I think there's another aspect to this when we talk about soft power and athletics is the non-governmental aspect of soft power. Because for those of you, following this stuff on Twitter, there's Freddie the German, who's like famously going to Waffle House and Chili's, and he's doing this road trip through the American South to get to New Orleans. Or like the Algerian team landing in Lawrence, Kansas, and like being like very welcomed, and the people in Lawrence like trying to make Algerian dishes and do these things. And so that people to people aspect too,
Hmm.
I think plays into the kind of soft power, and it's harder to control, obviously. Like governments can't just be like, oh, we're going to put you together and you're going to like each other. But I think there's kind of broader applications to the ability to do that because, people in Kansas aren't necessarily, going to have regular access to understanding Middle Eastern politics or North African politics. And this gives them a chance to like meet them and see the world. And then the same for Algerians that, because like, and I think the World Cup is like a great example of this, where when we think of America, when non-Americans think of America, it's quite often New York City or LA or maybe Chicago, Washington, D.C., but the US is a very big country. And now they're going to be able to see a whole bunch of parts of it and talk to like a whole bunch of people who aren't the typical ones represented in media or, diplomacy or any of those kinds of things.
Yeah, assuming they were given a visa to get into the country in the first place, which has been which has been tricky for some
For
of
some,
not
yes.
for some, yeah, and some for possibly the right reason, and then some not looking a bit interesting.
I mean, you had the
Uh,
the Ghanaian ban from Canada because he's being
yeah,
charged in the UK. But then you
yeah,
have the
yeah,
example of the Somalian in the US who had terror ties, which is such a vague. When I
yeah. I
read
know.
that, I was like, okay, I don't mean this derisively, but there are a lot of terrorists in Somalia, and so I have no doubt that extended family members might have connections, or like that was a
Look hard
terrible
enough.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Like with, with a lot of places and a lot of people, look hard enough and I'm sure you can find a reason to not allow them a
yeah.
visa. So yeah, not quite sure what that was about, but um, just interesting kind of, side elements of,
Hmm.
of well, also of having a tournament that's spread across three countries
Mm.
that are also pretty diverse countries too.
Yes.
Uh, which makes for an interesting element to it as well. Um,
The Koreans drinking in Mexico is my other favorite social media thing. Like God, they look like they're having so much fun, and like again, that people to people connection, I think
yeah,
it's wonderful, but it's also interesting from like a political thing, because that's another example of two people who are unlikely to come into contact with each other, either geopolitics or trade. But then, suddenly, South Koreans are being introduced to Mexicans, and Mexicans are being introduced to South Koreans, And it may not have an immediate impact on foreign policy or geopolitics, but it does create those kind of connections that like a lot of governments actually want to happen. That's why like the US has like the
Yeah.
Fulbright scholarship and a number of things to get people to study in the US to create those people to people connections, which is later beneficial generally in sort of foreign policy and geopolitics.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I like about these types of tournaments is that they tend to throw up like interesting matches.
Mm.
And what you will quite often get are big geopolitical rivals will suddenly end up playing each other directly. And then the game starts to be framed around
Hmm.
these big geopolitical rivalries, which is crazy because obviously really the players aren't
Hmm.
really going to care. They, I can't remember. I can't remember if it was the last World Cup or the one before, and the US ended up playing Iran
Yeah.
in a game, and it just and they make the media makes such a huge thing out of it that really has no relation to actually what's happening on the pitch. It doesn't become like
Yeah.
this sort of like battle for or, like it's not a Hollywood movie. It's not.
Hmm.
It's not Rocky.
And like, so another aspect kind of related to that on sports is, the use of sports or athletes to promote like particular ideologies that you're wanting to do. There was very controversial stuff here a couple years ago, Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling during the national anthem. And I think we're probably going to see not necessarily that, but we have like going back, I think it was the 72 Olympics, or the 76 Olympics, where you had Black Americans standing with the power
But
fist,
yeah, yeah.
and using
Mm.
using the limelight of sports to promote particular beliefs or ideas. I think is another interesting aspect of kind of the politics of sport. Because again, the sports itself is apolitical, but they're trying to use their platform to promote stuff. And so I kind of question, because I don't pay attention enough to broader athletics. But do you see that same kind of thing in the UK or Europe?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So around the Black Lives Matter movement, a whole host of players and teams would, for a long time, they would take a knee before the game started. Um, and what you saw was just through a lot of different sports in various different ways, um, people kind of supporting the Black Lives Matter movement through the actions they did. So sometimes I think it was, I maybe getting this a little bit wrong, but I think in some sports they would wear black armbands.
Hmm.
Others, some would take the knee, um, and just various things like that. So yes, we do see it fairly frequently um, through sport around big domestic and international political issues. It will extend to those that I think people can see themselves getting behind. So maybe things like the Ukraine war and
Hmm.
other things like that. You can see people make statements around that. Um, and if there was any kind of big unrest around social issues, probably see something like that. But we've had lots of interesting things that you wouldn't think would be an issue, like the football captain Harry Kane wanted to wear the sort of rainbow or the gay pride sort of flag as his captain's armband.
Hmm.
But that was not allowed by the Football Association for some reason. Uh, and so it's just minor little things where players want to show support for various causes, social causes that they support, that suddenly starts to put them into kind of slight conflict with the governing bodies
Mm.
over what you might consider, like I would consider that to be very sort of a very minor issue. I can't understand why. I'd have to look back and try and
Yeah.
understand why that occurred, um, because that was a very odd one of like why you would try and ban somebody from doing that, because I'm not sure. As a political statement, it's hardly kind of new
Yeah. Or
or
overtly
kind of extreme.
controversial and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Anyway, so yeah, we do see it a lot through the UK and Europe,
Hmm.
definitely.
Yeah, and I like this is interesting to me because in the US it was very controversial because do want to believe that sports are entirely apolitical. And
Mm,
so now the reason I'm saying this is because it's a little bit ironic for especially, our European audience who's never really been to like American football games, American football. Where you have like F-16s flying over and like fireworks and deep amounts of
yeah,
patriotism, and
yeah,
I'm not
yeah, yeah.
criticizing that. I'm deeply
Mhm,
patriotic myself,
mhm,
but that's a very like overt propaganda aspect of athletics that is wonderful in a lot of ways because we sing our national anthem and it really
mhm,
does create that sort of unity aspect that I think is wonderful. Um and like I was watching the US play last night and the national anthem come on and like all of us in the bar were singing it. Like it was like I
mhm.
love that stuff, but it's
Yeah, yeah.
also, we have to recognize it is what it is, where it is trying to promote a certain understanding of American patriotism in the United States. And so this is where the messaging within sports, even when it attempts to be political, it's different and slightly more complicated than the general idea that politics is entirely separate from it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, Kaepernick's career never recovered
Mm,
after the stance that he took, as I understand it,
mhm.
which is an interesting thing that it was so divisive
Yeah.
in the US. And and here, the Black Lives Matter and taking the knee did also, that was cause for a lot of discussion of like, should players on a field at that time
Mhm.
do that and take a stance in that sense. And obviously lots of people for and against it. So lots of people on both sides, because I think in a lot of places people think, like you say, that sport should have nothing to do with politics, and sport is sport, and that's where it should be left. And then it's like, well, if players want to take a stance, they should be doing it outside of the sporting arena and doing it in other environments.
Mhm.
But that's tough, isn't it? That's tough if you feel particularly strongly about something. But how do you then use the platform that you have, uh, and should you use the platform you have? I mean, we run into this a lot with businesses. Should CEOs of major corporations,
Mhm.
should they take stances in the same way? Who should major corporations support in divisive social issues? Where do they stand? And all of that, runs very parallel. So even if you're trying to be apolitical, that you're just getting sucked in all the time, either because players as humans have feelings and they want to demonstrate those, or governments kind of want to use sports, to promote their own messages.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on the really important thing we kind of wanted to intellectually work through, or that I really wanted to intellectually work through when it comes to this, because you're right to make the comparison to CEOs and CEOs being forced to be political when they just want to make money and do their business
Yeah,
and they
yeah,
don't want
yeah.
to have to intervene in politics. And this is where I'm not saying I support this because I really don't support the politicization of all aspects of life. I think it's very bad. Politics is meant to keep our house in order. It's not to be a universal aspect of identity or the
Hmm.
entire way we orient ourselves. And so when I say this, I'm saying it analytically. A lot of people want that though, and you're seeing that
Yeah.
kind of impact, the
Hmm.
totalizing impact of politics and sports being represented as like part of this. Because we had the hockey issue. There was some hockey competition. Again, I'm not the best at the sports ball. Um, but how, Cash Patel was there with like the hockey team in the locker room and then like the derisive comments that was made about the women's team, and then like, the men's team talking to Trump. And so it became deeply political when it shouldn't have been. Is
Hmm.
These men and women did very, very well in their athletics, and they were supposed to be celebrating, and then it was supposed to be, unifying, but politics got thrown into it still. And so I
Yeah.
think exactly what you're talking about is a deep problem within, broader life of where everything is getting politicized.
Yeah.
Sports is just one aspect to it. Because I think there's a difference between, what we were talking about at the earlier part of the conversation of governments trying to use sports to signal their particular beliefs or views or use it for soft power. I think that's very different than the politicization of sports. I think they're interconnected in certain ways, but they're not the same thing. But we have to kind of understand them as like part of the broader social trend that's going on.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, because if you think not that long ago, if a sporting team was successful and then they would either get, let's say, a visit from the president, or they might get invited to the White House, or in the UK, they might get invited to Downing Street to meet the Prime Minister. That was just part of that was like part of the procession. Like
Mhm.
you won X tournament, or you were successful in X way, and therefore you go and meet the leader of your country where they were in their sitting place of power, kind of thing.
Mhm.
But now you're kind of in this world where, okay, so you're part of this team, you do well, you get invited to meet Trump, for example, and then people are going to criticize you for going to that meeting, a
Yeah.
meeting with him, and it's be like, well, you should be taking us, you shouldn't go because you should be taking a stance against Trump, uh, and then I don't think it's quite, I don't think it's quite as bad here, but still, I think still the view would be like, well, why are you going to go and meet the Labour government? Like, why are you supporting them, kind of thing? And that's it. Really, it's just part of the pageantry of of success, and that's how. And I don't see anything wrong with that. You know, they're not trying to go as an overt, you know, support of any particular person or party within that country, but that's how it's becoming, I think.
First of all, I love that phrase, pageantry of success. That was a fantastic turn of phrase. Because you're 100% right that I think this is a modern part of, again, the trend we're discussing, where everything is politicized, every single
Mm,
decision, and I abhor that. Like, I,
yeah.
I hope that was clear that
Hmm.
analyzing it and observing it is not an endorsement. I think it's bad for life. I think it's bad for communities. But, you and I are analysts for a living, so we have to recognize the kind of trends that we see. And then this is where, we can turn this to, okay, how do we use all this kind of information? Like, we've had a good
Yeah.
conversation about like
Mm,
sports and politics. And that's where we can use it to represent other indicators, or use it to represent signaling of broader sort of foreign policy or politics. Because if, a whole bunch of sports teams are refusing to meet with the president, what that really indicates is their owners or them, you'd have to break down what's happening, but okay, so the president is deeply unpopular, is so unpopular that they don't even want to appear to endorse him. What does that mean for like the broader politics? Or a whole bunch of teams want to go meet the president all of a sudden. What does that indicate? And then the same thing for the signaling in like teams, um, of, okay, this is the likely direction of their foreign policy, because they're saying this is a really important issue that I'm wanting to occur. Um, and then, I think there's a kind of third indicator of this. We'd mentioned, like the immigration issue and like inability to get visas. And that, I think, is an example, not that people really needed it, of how harshly the Trump administration views like immigration, but they didn't even care doing it to a referee for
hmm.
an international
Yep.
tournament they're hosting. They're
Yeah.
saying, no, this is the way we're doing it. And so that's like an added signal of, oh, they really, really, are anti-immigration, and they're going to impose those kinds of rules and regulations, even if it's in front of the world and could embarrass them.
Yeah, that's a really good point actually, and uh, yeah, the point you make about teams meeting various different political figures is a really useful one, specifically because so many sports teams now are owned by people who are CEOs or have large businesses or have made money from large businesses, or in the Premier League in the UK, Middle Eastern royal families own a lot of the sports teams and that kind of thing. And so, like, as you can kind of track that and you can kind of see, and yeah, that's a really good point of like, that's going to give you some useful indications of kind of how the political landscape might be developing, who influential people are potentially backing and who they're not backing as well. And so, lots of people obviously, like, if you ever watch Ted Lasso, Football is Life, uh, then I think that gives you a good indication of how that might actually work. Okay. All right. Excellent, Tristan. I enjoyed that discussion. That was a good one. We'll wait and see who wins the World Cup. I would.
USA, USA,
Yeah.
USA.
Mm, yeah. Don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
England, I don't know. England, maybe, if I was being super, super optimistic, but I don't follow football as much as I used to, so I'm not.
I
I'm not so
slightly
sure.
want Curacao to win because it's an island of like 150,000 people, and if they beat all of like the great powers, that would be hilarious.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this World Cup's insane with the number of teams in it,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
and
yeah.
and kind of looking at some of the games, and like, I like watching big sporting tournaments, but when you look at some of the teams playing each other, you're like, it's going to be really hard to get excited about that game. but never mind. Anyway, thanks for your interest, and I hope everybody enjoyed that episode, and we'll talk to you all again soon. Goodbye, everyone. You have been listening to Boardroom Statecraft by Insight Forward. Music for this episode is by Barely Sentient on Suno. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram and TikTok and find out more about us at insightforward.co.uk.